It's great to see an almost full room. Thanks so much for coming out on this gorgeous evening. I am not going to talk very much. I want to welcome you. This is the first event in our speaker series for the year. We're really excited to bring you all together, and I think you are in for a treat. But I'm going to introduce our dean, Fritz Steiner, who knows our speaker, Sara Bronin, much better than I do, and those make for the best kinds of introductions. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Fritz, for being here as well.
Thank you, Lisa. Much better or much longer would be maybe more accurate. I first met Sara Bronin, then Sarah Galvin, at the airport in Austin, Texas, where she picked me up as the student representative of the Dean's Search Committee. And I have to, it was a visit, it was only my second time in Austin, and it changed my life. And so I owe a lot to that committee. Truth be known, I had a dream job lined up, and I hoped at another university, and I was sort of applying to Austin just in case. And then I went and just totally fell in love with Austin. So enough about me. Sarah, at the same time, roughly the same time, I think you just received the Rhodes Scholarship, or you were about to. So Sarah became a Rhodes Scholar, and there was, during my tenure at UT Austin, there was one other architecture student who got a Rhodes Scholarship too. I don't know of any other undergraduate school of architecture in the country that has 2 Rhodes Scholars. Maybe Cornell,
No.
But doggone it, that's good. So Sarah went to Oxford, and in that same period, 2001, 2002, as still a student, I believe, became involved in rebuilding Ground Zero. Arguably one of the most significant planning, urban design projects in so far this century. One of the really wonderful things about Sarah is how many disciplines in the school she touches. Because she graduated from UT Austin, both in architecture and this major called Plan 2, which is the only people in Austin, inside the city limits, I think, understand, or you pretend to understand what Plan 2. Everywhere else it's called the honors program, but Plan 2 is a really, really difficult program to get in. And so she double majored, went to Oxford, went to work for Ground Zero, then went to Yale Law School, and then started teaching at the University of Connecticut. She very involved in historic preservation, is President Biden's nominee to chair the U.S. Historic Preservation Advisory Council. And I guess that's in it's in Senate right now, waiting for Ted Cruz to wake up and discover that you're a Texan. Maybe that'll help or not. Also very involved with the protection of Hispanic heritage. Done also work in energy conservation, was a visiting scholar at the Kleiman Center. But for this audience was the chair of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission. And during that time, did some remarkable things for the city of Hartford. And now she's joined the faculty of Architecture, Art, and Planning and Law at Cornell. I think it's just fate and, that she's at Cornell at the moment. Because in the topic tonight, Sarah's, I think, emerged maybe if not the most important voice, one of the most important voices about zoning. And why I think Cornell is an appropriate, fateful place is, I remember John Reps, who wrote this scathing article about zoning in the early 60s called A Requiem for Zoning. Well, zoning's still with us, and I think one of the reasons it's still with us is zoning is legal. And so it becomes one of the main tools that planners can implement plans. So as Lisa said, I think we're in for a real treat. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to Philadelphia, Sara Bronin.
Thank you for that introduction. Am I on? Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. Thank you so much, Fritz, for that introduction. It was so great to have you as the dean at UT Austin, although we switched places, I think, within a couple months of each other, and to Shepard Russell Beaumont through that process. That's the second Rhodes Scholar through the at UT Austin. So just going back down memory lane a little bit was kind of fun. But I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to Lisa for inviting me. And I think I will pick up my slides and start. So the name of my talk today is The Equity Payoff of the National Zoning Atlas. I just wanted to a quick introduction to the topic of zoning. So I was just talking with Tom Daniel in the department, and he said that there's not a lot of conversation about zoning, and so hopefully these couple of slides help to frame it a little for folks who haven't encountered it in your classes yet. So zoning is the regulation of land uses, structures, and lots. So this is a map of Hartford, Connecticut, where, as Dean Steiner said, I did chair the city's Planning and Zoning Commission for 7 years, showing different zoning districts, each a different color. And each of those districts has distinct regulatory characteristics. So some districts will allow for commercial uses, some will allow for residential uses, single family or multifamily, industrial uses, parkland, and so on. Zoning can also regulate the form of buildings. So here's another image from the Hartford Zoning Code, which happens to be a citywide form-based code, regulating everything from heights to lot widths to, well, in Hartford's case, floor-to-ceiling heights and roof, porch, and other sort of formal features in buildings themselves. I mentioned here minimum parking requirements as well and minimum lot sizes, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of those. But zoning can require for each thing that's built a minimum acreage and then also a minimum number of parking spaces. So again, probably pretty basic, but just a quick introduction to make sure we're all on the same page. Exclusionary zoning is a kind of zoning that separates people from each other. So if you've heard this phrase before, and maybe the simplest definition is this first one, keeps affordable housing out of certain neighborhoods, because when we're talking about exclusionary zoning, we're really talking about residential zoning. This promotes the separation of people based on income and often based on race and ethnicity as well. Lots of studies have showed how zoning contributes to segregation. And it also produces worse health and educational outcomes because of the segregated nature of communities where poverty is concentrated in some places and not others. So exclusionary zoning, not a nice word, and we'll come back to some aspects of exclusionary zoning when we get more into the National Zoning Atlas. Last thing I wanted to say on sort of zoning and how it's set up is that people choose how they zone. This is a picture of my last meeting in the city's Planning and Zoning Commission. So a very diverse commission. Not all commissions are as diverse as Catherine Einstein and others have documented, but planning and zoning bodies at the local level hear applications, and their powers vary from state to state, and what they say varies from town to town. So we're talking about lots of local decision makers making decisions about how everything in their community gets built. In the United States, there's probably 30,000 local zoning jurisdictions, which means there's 30,000 local zoning boards and city councils that affect their decisions. So with all of that said, because of the way that zoning is made, it's made at the local level, I think that there's lots of opportunities to make sure that it's as good as it can be. It's not a broad federal policy, which would take decades to get some change through Congress. A local zoning change can happen in just a meeting or two. So I'm kind of an optimist when it comes to zoning. As we'll see in this presentation, zoning has done a lot of bad, but it has a potential to actually improve the way that our cities function, our communities function, not just cities. So just before we start, even though some of this will be somewhat pessimistic sounding, I do think that we can change zoning for the better. Okay, so with that in mind, a central question that I've been trying to answer in this research project, the National Zoning Atlas, is how do we zone? So we have 30,000 jurisdictions all across the country, but we actually don't really know that much about how each jurisdiction zones. And we have tried in different, because scholars have tried in different ways to try to understand how different communities zone. So there is, an index that's been developed right here at Penn. There's a National Longitudinal Land Use Survey, which has conducted surveys of planners in jurisdictions of a certain size. There's been some statewide surveys of planners. And these types of projects ask planners how they think their communities zone. These don't necessarily tie to what the zoning codes actually say. There have been some studies that have looked at the text of zoning codes. So zoning codes consist of both written rules about those districts that I mentioned and maps like the one that you just saw in Hartford. So with the written code and the maps, a couple of teams have put together textual analyses. There's one in Massachusetts, a couple in Massachusetts, the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, and then this MAPC project, the latest one in Massachusetts, the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, has also logged information about zoning, and particularly zoning as it relates to housing, and mapped that. So these are steps in the right direction because they're looking at the actual zoning text, but they're not very comprehensive. So I think these are all the ones that have been done. It's basically 3 in Massachusetts and 1 that's working out of California. So looking at the landscape of research that's been conducted on zoning data, it became really clear in embarking on this project that we need more information about what zoning codes actually say, and we need to tie that information to geospatial data that will tell us where those regulations are actually in effect. So textual analysis plus geospatial data. So with that, I guess, research case made for the National Zoning Atlas, I want to talk a little bit about the project itself. So the aim of this project is to translate and standardize zoning information into a unified public interface. Currently, we have projects in 12 states. We have project teams that include universities, prestigious planning institutions like the Regional Plan Association and the Urban Institute, actually libertarian organizations like the Frontier Institute, and state agencies like New Hampshire Housing and the state of New York's Office of Planning. All of these teams are working together to collect this information using a methodology that we publish. It's about 90-something pages, and it goes line by line, explaining to researchers across these states how people should read zoning atlases and then how they should then code this information into a master spreadsheet that I'll show you an image of in 2 slides. And so just to give you an idea of how the data collection works before we jump into what it says, we have 2 different parts. So I told you a zoning code is both the text and the map. So when it comes to the text, that's this column on the right. We start with generating the list of jurisdictions with zoning. In the case of Connecticut, there's 180 zoning jurisdictions, and 2 that have subdivision regulations. In New York State, we're finding that about 25% of local governments do not have zoning. And I'm sure as we get into Pennsylvania, where we don't have an atlas yet, or other states that have totally unincorporated areas, we'll find even more variety. So, but first we need the list of places that have zoning. Then we get their zoning code and map, which in some cases is harder than it looks. For the map, we collect GIS layers, or we create them if we need to. While we're doing that, we get the zoning codes, look at those, and I'll show you that in just a second. We merge the data, and then we publish the atlas. So this is impossible to see at this time, but here's part of our spreadsheet that talks about, that logs which jurisdictions have zoning, what type of government it is, how long the zoning code is, the approximate number of districts, links, and so on. So this is sort of the process of gathering information about the jurisdiction. And then for each jurisdiction, what we have done is we've gone through and, is this a light? No, okay, oh yeah. So we've gone through and logged every single district within the jurisdiction. So Fishkill Village in New York, there's 1 family residence district, 2 family, 3 or more, business, general business, land conservation. And then here we log, is it an overlay or not? Is it mapped or not? Is it mapped but extinct, meaning it's no longer in the text, which we have had a few of those? What type of zoning district? Is it elderly only, affordable only? Does it allow 1 family, 2 family, 3 family, 4 or more family, and so on? So this spreadsheet is being completed for every town and every zoning district, and there's 100 different columns here, and we'll get into some more of the details of the columns, but just generally, some of them catalog uses, some of them catalog how the zoning code treats lots, and some of them catalog how the zoning code treats structures. So going back to that first definition of what zoning is, it regulates land uses, structures, and lots, and that's how our how-to guide and our methodology is organized. Okay, so we cross-reference the how-to guide with the spreadsheet that we've made available. Here's some examples of maps in Connecticut that we had to hand draw, including this one, which is super fascinating. That's hand drawn. So is that one. And these haven't changed in how many years. And I would say that these maps reflect, these maps happen to be old maps, but they also reflect the status of zoning, which is that it often hasn't changed for many years, which is why we have the outcomes that we do. Okay. So the first project to be completed in the National Zoning Atlas is Connecticut, where, as Dean Steiner said, I was previously, just before moving to Cornell, a professor at UConn, looking at these 180 zoning jurisdictions. We found 2,600 zoning districts, so each line that you saw, there's 2,600 of those in our Connecticut spreadsheet, and 32,000 pages of zoning text. And so one reason we added the column in the new spreadsheets in the other states is because we wanted to know how many tens of thousands of pages of zoning text everybody was going to be looking at over the course of this project. The resulting atlas that you see here, which is where this is the state of Connecticut, showing primarily residential districts mixed with residential and non-residential districts. You can see with so much dark purple that there's a lot of primarily residential land in Connecticut. That's probably true in every state. The way that this atlas works as a public document available online is you select what you want to see. So in this case, we've selected 1-family housing. Then the land meeting the criteria shows up in whatever shade of purple, whatever type of district we've logged it, one of those 3 districts. Anything that's gray means it does not satisfy the criteria. So you see here, when selecting 1-family housing, much of Connecticut shows up in purple. The atlas also shows if the town zones for single-family or multifamily housing, whether it allows accessory apartments, whether it allows multifamily housing near train stations, which makes sense from a climate and actually niceness perspective, since train stations and mixed use and dense zoning go hand in hand, or should go. And then we also know through the zoning atlas where minimum lot sizes are required. So looking back at this map zoomed in that I just showed you, we learned from documenting zoning characteristics in such detail with mapped data, we found that 91% of land allows for single-family housing as of right. Does anybody want to guess how much land is zoned for 4 or more family housing as of right? Meaning without onerous public hearing requirements? Yes?
3%?
Oh, you overestimated by 50%. 2%, but that was a good guess. 2%, I mean 3% would have been 50% better, but still pretty bad. So again here, we see, so much gray, really the opposite almost of the single family map. And we now know where multifamily housing is allowed as of right. If you're familiar with Connecticut, you would notice that a lot of that multifamily housing is concentrated in the state's poorest cities and most diverse cities too. So one place where you can see this is in the New Haven area. So New Haven is this kangaroo right here with 2 train stations right in the middle. These are maps that show first 1-family housing, then 2-family zoning, say 2-family zoning, 3-family zoning, and then 4 or more family zoning. So again here, by mapping these characteristics on a lot-by-lot basis, we can see pretty clearly that New Haven and East Haven and bits of Shelton, all of which are, you would say, the poorer communities in this region, are carrying all of the multifamily housing, at least the housing that's easiest to build. So you might be asking, why did we assemble all of this information in the first place? It's kind of a hassle. It seems like a lot of work. It took a whole bunch of people to do it. And the reason was because, if I can just make a quick aside about this group called Desegregate Connecticut, which was founded in 2020 to try to help people understand the links between zoning, segregation, and zoning and segregation, and also impacts as we expanded on the environment and environmental justice, as well as economic equity too. So here's a picture of our project team, at least the start of it. It did involve architecture and planning students and still does. So if you, this does trigger some interest and you're interested in Connecticut, there's always funding available for interns. So I'll put a quick plug into that. And here's the new director, or newish now, oldish maybe, months old, Pete Harrison. That Desegregate Connecticut effort had about 80 organizations that joined forces to advance zoning reform. As we gained momentum and started to work across the state, people really started to resonate with people. So we did have the AIA of Connecticut, the APA, the Trust for Public Land, and other environmental groups, Preservation Action and Preservation Connecticut, and Connecticut Main Street for the preservationists. Those are kind of the top 3 preservation organizations in Connecticut who are advocating for the first time for housing and zoning reform. But we also had groups that were not normally at the same table, the environmentalists and the home builders on our coalition. So that's something that I'm really proud about, and which is why I showed the slide, because I get a chance to talk about that. So when we were starting this effort of public education engagement on zoning, we really realized that people didn't know much about zoning, what it was and what it did, but also we could not answer questions about how Connecticut zones. So that is why we started to collect this information. We have since used that information, or Desegregate Connecticut has used that information to produce numerous reports that incorporate this data and make the case for change. So the National Zoning Atlas project is, I would say, a data project, but the reason that it came about was because of this effort in Connecticut that necessitated, in my opinion, better collection of data. And so these reports, they're all available online, and for anybody who's a planning and zoning nerd, they're really great bedtime reading. So I just wanted to, in my last few minutes, talk about 2 issues that we delved into in particular in Connecticut that might show you the links between the data we collected and equity issues and how they played out in this one state, and how we expect that they will probably play out in the other states as we're collecting more information. So the first issue is minimum lot size. So what is a minimum lot size? It is essentially the amount of land required per use. In this case, we were looking at minimum lot sizes for housing. So the larger the lot, the fewer homes can be built. And if few homes can be built, what does that do to the supply? It means there's less supply, which means that people have fewer choices, which means that housing gets more expensive. It's scarcer, it gets more expensive, it gets more unaffordable. So what you might call the economics 101 perspective here, the more you require a minimum lot size and the higher the minimum lot size is, the more likely it is that you are creating a community that's expensive and hard to get into. And so I view a minimum lot size as being one of the main, I guess, expressions of exclusionary zoning, or one of the main features that a zoning code might have that might lead to exclusion. So you might be asking yourself, well, what is an exclusionary lot size? Of course, it's going to be different from one community to another. Center City, Philadelphia, a large minimum lot size might be 1/8 of an acre, but scholars generally agree in most communities that half an acre is very large. So Bob Ellickson, one of my professors, studied New Haven, also actually Austin, Texas, and Silicon Valley, and found that that Connecticut has really the largest lot sizes of those three. Some communities have very low minimum lot sizes. Houston, which is my hometown, which does not have zoning, nonetheless does have subdivision regulations that in this case function as zoning. Houston has 1,400 square feet minimum lot sizes. For reference, an acre is 43,000 square feet. So when Houston reduced in its subdivision regulations its lot size, as Nolan Gray and others have documented, it actually led to a little housing boomlet. So in Connecticut, our research found that 81% of residential land requires 0.92 acres per single family home. So why 0.92 acres? Because a lot of zoning is R40 zoning, 40,000 square feet, just under 43,000 square feet of an acre. So we didn't cut it off at 1 acre when we did this. We cut it off at 0.92 acres, so 40,000 square feet or more. Again, you just heard Houston has 1,400 square foot zoning. 81% of the state requires this amount of acreage, which is absolutely crazy. Your eyes should be like, well, this should be crazy. Okay. 49% of land in the state requires essentially 2-acre zoning. And if you look at where this 2-acre zoning is, and even if you look at where the 1-acre zoning is, you see that that kind of zoning is not around the big cities. So the big cities are in all caps. So the Stanfords, the Bridgeports, the New Havens, Waterbury, Hartford, and sort of region around New London and Norwich. So these places don't have large minimum lot size. It's really everywhere else that does. And then you have these most exclusionary places. Half of 68 towns require 2 acres or more. So those towns that we saw that have a huge amount of their land zoned for 2-acre minimums. There's a number of offenders there. Across the state, 98% of land that is single-family housing had minimum lot sizes, and only 45% of land with 4 or more family housing allowed had a minimum lot size. So essentially, when you take out what land is zoned for single-family housing, for 98% of single-family housing, you have a minimum lot size of any kind. So again, just to reinforce, minimum lot sizes have an impact on equity. They reduce the number of homes, they make it more expensive. They do correlate with higher income residents and a higher percentage of white residents. And that's a finding that was confirmed recently by a young researcher, Jae-hee Song, who found that they drive up prices, they lead to segregation, that if you halved minimum lot sizes in Connecticut, it would reduce prices, and it would increase the supply of single-family housing. So this is just one paper that happens to focus on Connecticut that shows the impact of minimum lot sizes on these issues. Has economic impacts, of course, as well. So it reduces economic activity in Connecticut, these high minimum lot sizes, because it simply constrains the construction market. Connecticut has, for the last year or so, been at or near the very bottom in terms of building permits issued per capita. It also increases public infrastructure costs. So why is that? Because if you're building homes that are 1 acre apart from each other, you have to build roads, sewers, light, electricity, and other infrastructure in much greater lengths than you would in small lot neighborhoods. And then there's an environmental impact too. So as we have documented in this minimum lot size report, it not only increases the amount of forest and farmland that has been used that has been converted to residential development over the last 3 decades, but it also contributes to sprawl. So again, if you're building something far apart, you can't trick or treat to your neighbor's house. You have to drive to do that. All right, so that's all on minimum lot sizes, and happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. And just one more, I guess, example of exclusionary zoning as it works in Connecticut is zoning around train stations. So Connecticut actually has a pretty nice little tidy system of rail across the state. So coming from New York City, going along the coast to Boston, and actually the Hartford line that goes through Hartford. Very lucky. We have a direct train to Philadelphia, which is kind of fun. So please come anytime to Hartford. There are 62 stations and 40 transit towns with at least one of these stations. And we included the bus rapid transit system, which has fixed stations, much like train stations. So we found that in these 40 transit towns, only 8 make it easy to build multifamily housing near transit. So this has an environmental consequence, of course, because you want to build multifamily housing near transit. That's a really nice place to build it. The 8 communities that allow as-of-right multifamily housing are all Connecticut's poorest and most diverse communities. This is what the Zoning Atlas shows you if you go to it, just using Meriden as an example. At one of the communities that does allow as-of-right for-family housing, really anywhere within walking distance almost anywhere within walking distance of the train station. We also found that just 17 towns allow as-of-right multifamily in between 1% and 49% of land near at least one transit station. So they're not doing as well as the 8 towns, which allow it almost at 50% or more. And so this is an example, Elmwood here, which is a community in West Hartford that zones around its Connecticut Fast Track station. And then we found 15 of the 40 towns that do not allow any housing near any of the train stations, any as-of-right multifamily housing. And so here's Beacon Falls. At the same time, so tying that minimum lot size back in, we found that 22 of 40 towns have large minimum lot sizes for single-family homes near train stations. 12 towns have between that 1 and 49%. So Greenwich has a train station that fits that category. And 10 transit towns require large minimum lot sizes for at least half the land near their station. So I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, I'm realizing. But this is the example of one of those towns, between the 1 and 49%. Okay, so what we found was wealthy communities are the ones that are restricting that kind of housing near transit stations. So the median household income for the 22 towns that restrict multifamily housing is $80,000. So here's another example. 8 of those transit towns that require 8 of the 10 transit towns requiring large minimum lot sizes for single family housing on most of their land have less than 12% people of color. So I guess general summary, towns with larger populations allow more multifamily housing and single family housing near transit stations. So I'll just skip over that too. Okay, so Just a couple of concluding thoughts. This has motivated additional advocacy as these reports come out. We've had more people looking to get involved and try to be that change, so that we also develop these playbooks. And it's not just at the local level that people are working. In Connecticut, it has been a combination of people trying to make change at the local level as well as the State House, where fortunately the legislature did actually pass a series of reforms a year after Desegregate was founded, and we're hoping for more, including transit-oriented reforms in Connecticut soon. But it's important to note that the state level is a fertile place where some of this data can be used. Zoning comes from state legislatures. The standard zoning enabling acts of the 1920s still endure today, 100 years later. They have not really changed that much from when the U.S. Department of Commerce put out its model standard zoning enabling act. We're also seeing action at the White House. So President Biden just announced that the White House would tie some of its discretionary funding to zoning reforms or to good zoning. But this announcement, in my opinion, begged the question, well, how do jurisdictions zone now? And I think that's a question that the National Zoning Atlas is well poised to answer. So we are working with officials in the Biden administration to try to figure out how we can accelerate this project and how they can use the data that it creates to actually implement this and reward those jurisdictions that have changed their zoning for the better. So I want to close on the optimistic note. There's lots of efforts underway to improve zoning at the local, state, and federal levels. And as we are collecting this information, it's also a positive because we're going to be able to better see how zoning impacts segregation in schools, segregation in housing, opportunities to housing, access to jobs, transportation, access to nature, and what did I miss here? And infrastructure development as well as our food supply. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity in the data that we're collecting and a lot of different directions that researchers will be able to take it. And so with that, I'll just say thank you and open for questions.
Okay, so thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to maybe ask the first question while folks are getting their thoughts together. And I would love to know whether, I know it's still very new, but whether you've seen any change as a result of some of the research and the data that's collected. And where you think that most positive, what are the levers for change?
Yeah, so in Connecticut, the reforms that I just briefly touched on included legalizing accessory dwelling units, which I haven't talked about. It included including a minimum parking cap. We had found, so we did collect information about minimum parking requirements for each of these jurisdictions and found that there were some communities like Darien, Connecticut, which is a very, very wealthy town, that required 3 parking spaces for a studio apartment. So what person living in a studio is going to have 3 cars? Why is that a provision in the Darien zoning code? Just to stop that kind of housing from being built. So to drive up the cost of that housing. So that was another thing the legislature did, required actually for the first time training for planning and zoning commissioners, streamlined aspects of the Zoning Enabling Act and included language, including the first statewide language that required jurisdictions through their zoning regulations to affirmatively further fair housing. There's also some information about that on the Desegregate Connecticut website, where it has probably 10 things, and I think I just named 4. So, awesome. But that gives me hope because Connecticut is a very conservative state temperamentally. It's called the land of steady habits, so hard to change things there. And people think about zoning in some cases as being some kind of moral contract that they have a right to until the end of time. But I think what we're trying to show is that zoning needs to change, it needs to be updated, and it can be updated. And so these are some ways to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me take questions here. Okay, I'm going to start with Fritz and go back a little bit.
It's really fabulous, interesting. I believe under your leadership, Hartford developed a form-based code. Is a form-based code the answer? Or, to, is it one of the reforms that can be made?
Yeah, so actually Connecticut, as part of this package that was passed, became one of maybe 4 states to initiate a statewide form-based code from which jurisdictions could draw. So Connecticut has many distinctly individual and unique communities. However, the building stock from one community to the next is very similar. We think that form-based codes that permit development as of right, but provide the parameters within which that development can occur, can help for developers and property owners to understand what they have to build, and can help neighbors get more comfort in the development process. And when I say as of right, I mean removing public hearing requirements that happen at the stage of a development proposal. So the input should come, in my opinion, at the beginning of the process, identifying where housing can be built and setting out the parameters through a form-based code or otherwise within which that can occur. In Hartford, we might be the only largest city, 125,000 people, that allows all of its housing as of right. So there are no public hearings required for almost any use, actually. But we set out really carefully in the code how that housing must be built, because Hartford does have a lot of historic neighborhoods, so we want to respect that that fabric, but allow more uses within those neighborhoods, and also to make it easier for people who want to develop multifamily housing to do that across a wide variety of areas. So I do think a form-based code presents opportunities, but not if it's used to simply drive up the cost of individual home designs by making requirements that are really onerous to meet. And I think eliminating public hearings when you have a form-based code, I think those two things go hand in hand. And so I hope that we can continue to promote that.
Thank you. Francesca.
Hi, I'm Francesca Amman. I teach in planning and preservation. And thank you for this. We're talking about zoning in my class this week, so well timed.
Yes.
I'm a historian, so I'm overwhelmed by the ambition of the National Atlas, and it seems like you had complete information for Connecticut. It's going to be hard in certain states. And I wondered if you were lured at all by historical data that you came across and understanding how zoning has changed and why, since your goal is to change zoning. If there were, instances, if you thought that rather than trying for this completeness of the whole nation, it might be useful to go deep over time in a couple places and what we might learn from that. What is the history of zoning? I know to add to your database, another dimension, that's crazy, but might there be some interesting things to come from that? How's that?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So we are, I'm interested in the historical aspects too. Our goal right now is to document zoning as it is as of the date that team first collects the information, and then to keep it updated over time, but to timestamp it as changes are made, or conceptually timestamp it so that researchers can go back and see the pace of change starting from the moment we started collecting forward. Some of the project teams are going to be collecting historical data for specific jurisdictions. So we have a team in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I believe they've collected what is in that region exists now, and I believe they're also going to be going back to see what the zoning was before, especially since there's been a lot of zoning reforms happening in Minneapolis. So our task right now, as we've fundraised for this project, is to try to figure out, and we have database developers who we've interviewed and hopefully will be awarded soon, but we're trying to figure out with them, with a selected person, how we can collect the information in a way that does exactly that kind of goes forward and backward, but really just ties the information that we have to specific dates. Because of the way the information is collected, the Arizona Atlas may have a 2023, 2024 timeframe, whereas the Connecticut was 2020 and is updated. So we're going to have to figure out kind of how all of that gets integrated. But I do think that time stamping is an important part of this story, because then you'll be able to use this information to track actual things that are built. So track building permits and track the nature of development. So it's on the list. But yes, you're right. We're kind of hurdling to get these project teams up and running and to try to expand in breadth first.
Thank you. Chris. So many questions. This is awesome.
My name is Chris Quattro. I'm to be around you. I'm a doctoral candidate in city and regional planning. I study zoning, and both in my research and in my practical work, I just spend so much time combing through different ordinances for a variety of purposes. And so I really appreciate how much work it takes to get the details that you're collecting on these atlases and specifically like across jurisdictions. So that's kind of my question is, I've read a lot about what you're doing with the atlas, and my biggest challenge, my biggest question is always like, how do you possibly standardize when there's so many nuances from ordinance to ordinance where, a single family zoning district, there might be 5 in one city and 3 in another, and these 3 look completely different than these 5, and what they're permitting, both, and then the accessory uses and whether or not they permit certain accessory uses or what the development standards are within those, and it's so overwhelming to me, the idea of trying to standardize that in data as you're talking about. So how are you overcoming just the massive amount of variation and nuance from city to city, and are you concerned that you're losing some of that nuance when you're trying to map, and just say, well, this is single family, where even as you said, in Houston, single family might be for a tiny home compared to single family for an acre, and just how do you conceptualize that for the layman who might be looking?
Right, so that's why we don't go by the name of the district or by the, we don't have categories, like the small lot category gets a check. We're logging the exact numbers of minimum lot size. We're logging the districts that allow single family accessory housing and so on. So we're not looking necessarily at how many districts within a community. We're looking at that parcel of land, what its zoning is, and kind of taking out just the regulatory features. Now, in the how-to guide, so if you go to zoningatlas.org/how, there's a how-to guide, and then there's a spreadsheet. So those two, and I kind of glossed over that slide, but those two work together. So what we've done, we've already revised the how-to guide about 5 different times, and we post a new one every time we do. Because when a project team has a question, such as, they find something different. So Hawaii, for example, has found a few different things that we've uploaded to the Atlas. It's a very unique set of zoning rules, but we update the Atlas with the how-to guide with particular conditions that we found and explain in the methodology how future people should treat that condition. So if there is a nuance that we haven't included in the code, if we haven't included in the spreadsheet or we haven't included in the how-to guide, that's how we've accounted for it. So we've gone through 12 states so far that are underway, and as we get that, we just continue to add it. So it's certainly not a perfect process, but I think one of the ways that we try to avoid the jumbled mush is to separate out each and every characteristic. So the accessory dwelling columns, I think there's 12 of them. So each individual aspect that we've found with any commonality in commonness in zoning codes, we add a column for that.
John.
Yeah, thank you very much for a great presentation and for your work and for your example. I want you to put both your planner and lawyer hat on for a second. I want to ask you what you think of state zoning override legislation in the current period. It has sort of a checkered past. Massachusetts anti-stop zoning ordinance from the 70s, and then Mount Laurel ordinances in the 70s and 80s from New Jersey, and most recently California's Senate Bills 8, 9, and 10, which, as you were suggesting, basically legalize accessory units pretty much everywhere in the state. As a lawyer, do you think that's a good idea? As a planner, do you think that's a good idea? Sounds like a good idea, but in some of these cases, there's been an awful lot of pushback.
So the state efforts that have been underway historically have included litigation related changes, like the Mount Laurel decision in 1978 in New Jersey that requires communities across New Jersey to have their fair share, to zone for their fair share of housing. So there was a whole state agency apparatus and regulations that developed as a result of the court case There are other places, most of the state activity in zoning that has gone the route of statewide guidance for local governments has been politically through the legislature as opposed to through the courts. So just speaking about the reforms that have gone through legislatures, right now they are all pro-housing efforts. So for the most part, so the statewide rules are meant to encourage or require local governments to allow more housing. So if they were going the other way right now to, restrict local government's ability to allow more housing, then I might have a different view. But I think that many of the state efforts are positive because they help to level the playing field across communities that have really, for a long time, resisted really any new housing and any new residents. You see in the towns of Connecticut, the most exclusionary towns with the most exclusionary zoning have become more exclusionary over time. So they've ratcheted up their lot sizes and their populations have stagnated or decreased. So some of that data, if you're really interested in that and want another 100 pages of reading, is in a paper that I've published called Zoning by 1,000 Cuts. You can Google it, it's free download. But you do see that trend over time. So when you see those local governments getting more exclusionary, you do wonder who will step in. And in some cases, you do see that state governments and politicians are voting to, again, help to try to level the playing field.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I'm actually from Connecticut. A little bit familiar with Desegregate CT through your efforts. Great presentation. Thank you for tonight. My question is regarding the National Zoning Atlas. I'm curious, as you mentioned, I think there were like 12 states involved in it already. How long does it typically take for a state to complete, their set of the atlas? I know every state is different. It must be hard to compare. Do you have like a goal for how long you want this project to take, or like a deadline for
next week? That is my goal. Just to give you an idea, the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, we collected the bulk of the data in 3 months. We had a team of 10 Yale undergrads who helped to fan out. We actually didn't even know what we were going to collect, so we had them collect zoning codes, and we said, well, look at this. And they found, we also find this provision. So we just kept adding columns to these students' work. So we were kind of building the car while we were driving it in that case. But it nonetheless took 3 months to do 180 jurisdictions. For the Zoning Atlas, I had a class with 7 students, and we did about 70 jurisdictions in upstate New York in 7 weeks. So it really depends on kind of how much effort people are putting into it. I mean, you could do a whole state with one person. You could do, especially if it's Hawaii, which has only 4 zoning jurisdictions, but they're kind of complicated. But it depends on the team. We're hoping a Pennsylvania team starts up pretty soon. Anybody who's interested, please find me, and because that's
new student club.
It's definitely emerging. But the benefit to the people who are starting these teams is that they have that access to all of that data and information that they can then do secondary research on it. And I think it'll be really fulfilling for the project teams. So it's going to take different amounts of time in different states. So Texas has a lot of jurisdictions. Ohio has 2,000 jurisdictions. We've started the Ohio Atlas with the largest cities. About 200 of those are already logged. But there's a bunch of other tiny little jurisdictions. So if the goal is full coverage, then we are going to need to keep going there for some time as we dig up all of that. It also depends on the urgency of the project team and how urgent they want to make it. So we're trying to encourage everybody to work quickly and accurately, and hoping to get some more support from foundations for those jurisdictions, like maybe in North Dakota, where there's not a planning school necessarily, and there's not sort of innate interest, but we want it to be covered nonetheless.
Is that Amina?
Yeah.
It's with the mask, it's always a little difficult.
Yes. Hi, Amina. Thank you so much for your talk. I have sort of a 2-part question. One, could you speak a little bit about how your training as an architect informs the work that you're doing now? And 2, could you speak a little bit about how young students, planners, and designers can get involved in policy advocacy?
Yeah, so training as an architect. Well, I think that education at UT Austin was the cornerstone for everything that I do. I think being trained as an architect requires you to think interdisciplinarily. You learn about history, you learn about theory, you learn about structural design. I think it's extremely valuable education, and it's unfortunate that so few people can kind of pursue it and get to the end of it. But it's one of the reasons why I pursued my architecture license, working while I was a law professor for a developer slash architect to get all of my hours in full-time. I had multiple full-time jobs because it was really important for me, especially as a Hispanic female, to get my license and to kind of show that that is an important part of me, even though I don't really design buildings. The other thing that architecture does is teaches you how to walk around the world and see just the value of beautiful, well-designed, well-constructed things. And when you can recognize the value in those places, and you see that there's so many barriers to buildings and places of value, then you really having that training kind of gives me the urgency to want to change it. And so part of the reason I went to law school right after architecture, or I guess after graduate school, then architecture school, is because I realized in architecture school that actually the architects, need to get more and greater understanding of law so that they can change it. So to your next question about how young people can get involved, there are housing groups like Desegregate Connecticut that are forming or exist everywhere. Even the traditional housing organizations are getting a little bit more involved in zoning reform. I mean, I always think zoning reform is essential because that's the rules of the land use game. That dictates everything that gets built. It dictates how architects can do their work. It dictates whether planners are successful. It dictates whether mayors and other people who care about their city will be successful. And it works in ways that we don't even know. So I think you should raise your hand and get involved in any organization that you feel like is like-minded. And if you don't see that organization, then you should start it. So I really do think that. I started Desegregate Connecticut with a Zoom call, and it just kind of snowballed, or the boulder went down the hill and just kind of kept going. And I don't think I have any great powers of organizing or inspiration or anything. I just knew that people wanted to know about this problem, and I had information just like you do now in your training. That people should know. And so that's kind of, maybe you can call it the responsibility that you have now with this great education that you're getting here. So that's how I look at it. Raise your hand if you're not going to do it. Nobody else is going to be more knowledgeable than the people in this room about these issues. So go for it.
Stay a little later, start the group. Back here. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I know you mentioned obviously it's very difficult to implement zoning reform on a national level, but given some possible glimmers of hope, what would you like to see, especially considering that if it were to happen, it would have huge impacts on very diverse communities?
So there's actually a legal question here about whether the federal government can or should be involved in zoning at all. And I think the best argument for that is that zoning cumulatively has effects on interstate commerce. So that gives Congress a hook to consider regulating in that regard. If Congress were to consider doing that, I would actually have them look to the data that we've collected so far and secondary research that is emerging from that, or will be hopefully in the next 6 months, a year or more. And try to see what the individual levers of zoning are that actually make an impact and hinder our economy or hinder equity. But if it were me, I think the biggest thing that I would change in zoning, if I could wave a magic wand, is minimum parking requirements. I would eliminate those because of how detrimental they are across equity, environment, economy, everything. They make our places much worse. And so that, to me, would be a no-brainer. We should just do that, and at least that'll help save some of our central cities from the surface parking related slow deaths that they've been subjected to in part because of zoning.
All right, I think we have time for one more, right here.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation.
one. I know Alice has a lot of partners, and you have their how-to guides to standardize the work. Could you please explain a little bit more about what else did you do to ensure the accountability or the consistency of the work with different partners?
Yeah, so that's something that I work on every day. So I've helped to set up these project teams, and if they're university researchers like Professor Menendian at Berkeley, he's all set. He does not need my guidance. But some are, more professional, non-academics, and so they might need a little bit more guidance in trying to make sure that everything is consistent, or people who know something about zoning, but maybe not, haven't gone into the details too much. So I do view that as a big part of my job as a convener of this sprawling, no pun intended, project, is to try to make sure that everybody's doing the same thing. So one way to do that is I've created all the spreadsheets that the project teams are using, except for California. And so I can see what's happening in real time. When a student researcher puts a note in, I can see it, and I can see what the response is from the project team lead, and I can kind of monitor that way. So I try to make sure that's being done. We did recently receive funding for a full-time project coordinator for a couple of years, and so he's hopefully he's a lawyer. And has been an adjunct out at Illinois in the planning program. So hopefully he'll be able to take some of that on as well, and we hope to expand the team more so that there's even more consistency across. In addition, that database developer that I talked about, part of their job is going to be instituting systems that allow for data input that's a little bit more foolproof than Google spreadsheets, because that is definitely not an ideal way to do it. But it's free, everybody can access it, that's what we're using now, but hopefully we'll be able to change over to reduce those kinds of errors. But it's not just about reducing errors and maintaining sort of a project-like consistency. I think part of the other thing that we have to do with this project is to hopefully try to encourage people to take an interest in the collection of this data and imagine the many different ways that it can be deployed once collected. So I don't want to leave you with just the technical cleanup data point, but I do want to leave you with the thought that this project hopefully will be something that you can mine at some point in the future as you work in your communities after graduation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think what I really appreciate about this project is that it's informed by academic research, but it's so practical and then has so much application. And those are our 3 points that are really hard to hit on. So, and I can tell you've really inspired our students who hopefully will go out and do some of this work yourselves. So let us give just one more round of applause for Sara Bronin.
Thank you.